Long before the rise of Rome, before Babylon carved its name in stone, before kings, cathedrals, or even crosses, there was Egypt, a land of splendor and science, of gods made of stone, and a throne that claimed divinity itself. It was here, in the golden shadow of towering pyramids and glistening palaces, that a forgotten slave dared to walk into the court of a living God. His name was Moses, but this is not the Sunday school tale you've heard before. This is a cosmic confrontation. Not just a man versus a king, not just staff versus crown, but heaven against hell, Yahweh against the gods of Egypt, a collision of realms. Because Pharaoh wasn't just a political tyrant, he was a spiritual stronghold. He was the high priest of rebellion against the God of Israel, a man possessed by pride, backed by demonic forces, and blind to the storm that was coming. And Moses, he was no mighty warrior, no silver-tongued hero. He was a fugitive with a stutter, a man with nothing but a stick in his hand and the word of the Almighty in his mouth. But when that word was spoken, the Nile turned to blood. Frogs rose like a tide. Lice crawled from the dust. Flies blackened the air. Disease struck livestock dead. Boils blistered skin. Hail shattered Egypt's pride. Locusts devoured its glory. Darkness swallowed its gods. And death walked through its doors. These were not just plagues. They were judgments. Divine strikes aimed at the very heart of Egypt's spiritual system. Each plague a direct blow to the gods Pharaoh trusted. Each one louder than the last. Each one screaming, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh hardened his heart again and again, until mercy ended, and wrath stepped in. Now, walk with me through this ancient battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of signs and wonders, of trembling hearts and stubborn pride. Because behind every plague is a mystery, behind every command is a warning, and behind every cry in Egypt is the unseen war between darkness and light. This isn't just history, it's prophecy in motion. It's your Bible, come alive. It's Moses versus Pharaoh, the real power behind the 10 plagues. And trust me, by the end, you'll never see the book of Exodus the same way again. If you're ready for breathtaking biblical truth, high-stakes spiritual warfare, and a divine drama that shakes the earth, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode. Let's uncover the story beneath the story, the battle that still echoes through eternity. Let the plagues begin. Moses versus Pharaoh, the real power behind the 10 plagues. The first plague, water turned to blood. The Egyptian sun blazed over the Nile like an unforgiving torch, searing the backs of laboring Israelites who had forgotten the sound of freedom. Their cries for deliverance floated on the desert wind like forgotten prayers. Pharaoh's monuments rose high and proud, carved by enslaved hands, each stone a defiance against the God of Abraham. Egypt's heart beat in the Nile River, a sacred lifeline that nourished fields, filled cisterns, and fed both man and beast. Yet it was in those same sacred waters that heaven would strike first. Moses stood still on the riverbank, his weathered staff gripped tightly. Beside him, his brother Aaron waited, the weight of divine assignment in his chest. Behind them lay a lifetime of preparation. Exile in Midian, the fire of the burning bush, the voice that thundered from flames yet did not consume. Now, after confronting Pharaoh's arrogance and hearing the cruel laughter echo through marble halls, they stood ready. The Nile flowed calmly, unaware of the confrontation about to unfold between a mortal empire and the eternal God. Pharaoh had scoffed at Moses. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" He had mocked the God of the Hebrews as if Yahweh were just another powerless tribal deity. But this was no ordinary God Pharaoh had challenged. This was I Am. Moses lifted his hand at the edge of the river, eyes blazing with fire not his own. The Lord had spoken clearly. "Take the staff in your hand and strike the water of the Nile. It shall turn to blood." Pharaoh's pride had invited a judgment so terrifying it would make even sorcerers tremble. The staff, once a simple shepherd's tool, now carried the authority of heaven. As it struck the Nile's surface with a thunderous crack, the impossible happened. A crimson flood exploded from the point of contact, boiling like it had been pierced at the heart. What had once been life-giving water now frothed into blood. Real blood, thick, dark, vile. The scent of iron filled the air, followed by the sickening stench of death. Fish flipped violently at the surface before floating lifeless, their scales dull, their eyes vacant. The great Nile, the pride of Egypt, was bleeding out before its gods. From the majestic river to the smallest bowl in an Egyptian home, the curse spread like wildfire. Even water stored in stone jars turned to blood. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't illusion. No priest or magician could reverse it. For 7 long days, the land choked under the weight of this first divine blow. Women screamed as they opened wells to find thick blood where water once danced. Livestock refused to drink, their mouths stained and confused. Children wept. Markets froze. The Nile's edge, once a place of morning peace and ritual bathing, became a field of rotting carcasses and death-slick stones. Life in Egypt began to unravel. Still, Pharaoh stood firm. He watched from his palace steps, his jaw clenched in defiance. His magicians, men of secret arts and hollow miracles, managed to mimic the sign with their own enchantments, turning a small portion of water to blood. But that only worsened the crisis. They could copy, but they couldn't heal. Egypt didn't need more blood. It needed cleansing, and they couldn't give it. Pharaoh's heart grew harder. To his court, he declared Moses nothing more than a manipulator of illusions. To his people, he presented the blood-stained Nile as an annoyance, not a sign. Yet in his heart, fear whispered a question he would never say aloud. What if the God of the Hebrews was real? In Goshen, where the Israelites dwelled, the story was different. Their water remained untouched. No blood fouled their wells. No fish floated belly up. No screams pierced the air. A strange silence rested over their camp, peaceful, reverent. The elders knew this was not merely about Egypt's pride. This was about God reintroducing himself to the world that had forgotten him. Yahweh was not silent. He was not absent. He had seen the blood of the Hebrew children Pharaoh had once ordered drowned in that same Nile. And now that river wept. Each day the Egyptians grew more desperate. Water was hauled at great cost from distant places. But even the effort could not erase the fear now embedded in every heart. Every cup raised to a child's lips trembled. Every priest who prayed to the gods of the Nile returned unanswered. Egypt's gods were silent, stone faces mocking their worshippers with lifeless eyes. But Yahweh was just beginning. As Moses walked away from the Nile, his steps slow and steady, the wind carried with it a warning. The first plague had struck Egypt's pride, its economy, and its gods, but it had only wounded. Pharaoh had been given a chance to repent, to release the children of Israel and humble himself before the God of heaven. He refused, and heaven had more to say. The second plague, the plague of frogs. Pause and think, if God moved this powerfully then, imagine what he can do in your life today. And while you're here, drop a comment telling us where and what time you're watching this video from. We'd love to know who's watching around the world. The Nile had barely recovered. Its waters, though slowly returning to their color, still carried the stench of death. The people of Egypt whispered in the shadows now. Fear had crept beneath their golden roofs and behind their painted doors. Merchants spoke with hushed voices. Servants walked with cautious steps. Even Pharaoh's own palace felt colder. And yet he refused to bow. The Lord had given him time to reflect, time to release his people, time to soften a heart that was becoming less flesh and more stone. But Pharaoh had made his decision. The bloodied river hadn't bent his will, it only bruised his ego. And so heaven raised its voice again. It began subtly, a croak in the distance, then another, and another. At first it was just an unusual sound, nothing more than the call of nature near the still wounded Nile. But the sound grew louder. By noon, it became a chorus. By evening, a plague. Frogs. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Tens of thousands. They came like an army of green invaders, leaping through city gates, hopping down stone streets, pouring over walls as if driven by an unseen commander. They came for every home. They filled the bedrooms of nobles. They leapt onto the laps of Egyptian priests in mid-prayer. They crawled under pillows and into pots, into ovens and kneading bowls. Women screamed as cold. Wet bodies thudded against their feet while cooking. Children cried as frogs jumped on their faces while they slept. Pharaoh's soldiers tried to crush them, but the more they struck, the more came. The mighty empire was being humbled, not by lions, not by armies, but by frogs. At night, the city was haunted by a sound none could silence, a ceaseless, maddening croak that echoed off every palace column and temple wall. Sleep became a lost memory. Even Pharaoh could not rest. He tossed and turned on his golden bed, swatting in vain at the creatures who had no fear of thrones. This plague wasn't just discomfort, it was divine irony. Egypt had worshipped Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of fertility and life. She was supposed to be a sign of blessing, of birth and fruitfulness. But now her symbol was a curse. Frogs were everywhere, but now they brought disease, fear, and chaos. The gods of Egypt had been turned against Egypt itself. In the morning, Pharaoh, bleary-eyed and humiliated, summoned Moses and Aaron. There was no mocking tone now, no laughter, just desperation. He looked at Moses, not as an enemy, but as a gatekeeper to sanity. "Plead with your God," Pharaoh hissed, "that he may take the frogs away from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord." Moses didn't plead. Not yet. He offered Pharaoh something unexpected, the choice of timing. "You choose when," Moses said. "Tell me when I should pray for the frogs to depart, and it shall be done, so that you will know. There is no one like the Lord our God." Pharaoh paused, maybe out of pride, maybe to test him. "Tomorrow," he said, and Moses nodded. "As you say." That evening Moses stood again before the Lord. His voice rang out, not in rage but in command, a servant echoing his king. And just as God had promised, the next day the frogs began to die all at once. It was as if the land exhaled a foul breath. Frogs collapsed in heaps, on streets, in courtyards, behind market stalls. The dead were gathered in mounds, rotting in the sun. The smell was unbearable. Egypt was being taught a lesson that no plague could let them forget. Yahweh was not one God among many. He was the only God. But Pharaoh? When relief came, his heart hardened again. He looked out across the land, torn, stinking, disrupted, but with frogs no longer crawling across his bed. And he changed his mind. Again. The promise he made to Moses melted in his pride. He would not let Israel go. He had forgotten. God was not negotiating. He was judging. This wasn't over. The frogs were just the second whisper of thunder. A louder voice was coming, a more terrifying sign, because every time Pharaoh hardened his heart, heaven prepared another strike. And the next one would be worse. Will Pharaoh finally break? Or will his stubbornness invite a storm Egypt was never meant to survive? The third plague, the plague of lice, when dust turns against you. Egypt still reeled from the rot of death. The croaking had stopped, but the silence left behind was even more terrifying. The frogs were gone. Yet they had left behind a legacy of filth, decay, and humiliation. Every breeze carried the stench of dead amphibians. Every corner reminded the people that Egypt's gods were silent, and a foreign god was marching through their empire, one plague at a time. But Pharaoh's pride was a fortress, strong, unmoved, and blind. Though he had promised Moses freedom for Israel, the moment peace returned, his heart closed again like iron doors. He mocked the moment of weakness he had shown, laughing at the very idea of bowing to a Hebrew god. His counselors whispered that it was just coincidence, that the Nile had always been mysterious, that frog infestations were natural. They told him what he wanted to hear, not what heaven was saying. But God had not spoken his last word. Moses stood before Aaron once more, outside the view of Pharaoh, but under the gaze of the heavens. This plague would not come with a warning. This time, there would be no opportunity for Pharaoh to reconsider. No polite visit to the palace. No choice of timing. No dialogue. This was a direct strike, swift, unannounced, unrelenting. Moses lifted his eyes to the sky as the Lord's voice thundered in his soul. Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Dust, that same dust from which man was formed. That same dust God had once breathed into to make Adam live. That dust would now carry judgment. Aaron, silent but resolute, raised the rod high above his head and struck the dry, sun-scorched earth. And in a moment the dust changed. The ground seemed to shimmer. Then it shifted. Then it moved, alive. It started around their feet. What looked like grains of sand began to crawl, then swarm, then leap into the air. Lice. Tiny, merciless, blood-hungry lice. Millions of them, birthing instantly from every patch of soil, every corner of farmland, every dry rock and dusty path. From the desert plains to the temple courtyards, the lice swarmed like a living fog. Egypt's people cried out. Lice covered their skin, biting, burrowing, itching with a demonic intensity. Children screamed and tore at their flesh. Women wept as they watched the creatures infest their hair, their clothes, their beds. No oil or perfume could mask it. No covering could stop it. The creatures clung like punishment, multiplying with every breath of wind. Even the livestock suffered. Bulls thrashed in the fields. Horses galloped blindly into fences. Goats rolled on the ground, trying to rid themselves of the invaders. This was no coincidence. This was war. But the humiliation wasn't finished. The plague marched into the sacred precincts of Egypt's most honored figures, the priests. These men, obsessed with purity, would bathe twice or more a day to be deemed worthy to enter their temples. They wore pristine robes, shaved their bodies, and avoided any trace of uncleanness. But now lice covered them, in their hair, in their armpits, beneath their linen garments, on their scrolls, even crawling across their sacred idols. The gods they served couldn't protect them. Their rituals failed. Their mantras died on their tongues. The unclean had invaded the holiest chambers of Egypt. And so Pharaoh turned to his magicians, those sorcerers who had, in the past, mimicked Moses' miracles with their enchantments. Perhaps they could reverse it. Perhaps they could explain it. But this time, they failed. They tried. Oh, they tried. With herbs, incantations, blood rituals, and sacred powders. But nothing worked. The lice remained. They multiplied. They laughed at every gesture of powerless men pretending to be divine. The magicians, sweat-drenched and trembling, stood before Pharaoh and declared something they never imagined would pass their lips. This is the finger of God. Not magic. Not nature. God. They had finally admitted it. The God of the Hebrews was not a desert spirit or a tribal myth. He was real, and his hand had touched the earth. Pharaoh's face twisted in fury. Not because of the lice, not because of the pain, but because of the confession. His own men were now proclaiming his enemy's God as superior. His throne wasn't just being challenged, it was being shaken. But still, his heart was hardened. He clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, denied the obvious. He would not yield. He would not bend. And so Egypt, once the land of gods and gold, became the land of itching, groaning, and crawling misery. But in the shadows of the slave camps, among the Hebrews, a quiet hope began to rise. This plague, like the others, had struck their captors, not them. Was God making a distinction? Was he beginning to set his people apart? Had the God of Abraham truly returned to deliver them? The whisper grew, among the elders, among the families, even among the children, who asked their mothers if the frogs and lice meant that freedom was near. And somewhere in the shadows, Moses listened. He knew. This was just the beginning. Each plague was a sentence in heaven's declaration. And Pharaoh had only read the first few words. The dust of Egypt had turned against it. What would come next would shake its skies, split its hearts, and draw a line between the enslaved and the delivered. Will Pharaoh finally realize he's not at war with Moses, but with the Almighty himself? Or will Egypt continue to crumble under the weight of divine judgment? Are you feeling the weight of this battle yet? Imagine what's still ahead. If this is blowing your mind, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next explosive move God makes. The fourth plague, the plague of flies, when the air becomes a weapon. The sun rose on Egypt, but it brought no warmth. It hung low and dim, like it knew something was coming, something darker than night. The people of the land awoke not to the songs of birds or the rustle of river reeds, but to silence, a heavy, unnatural stillness. Even the wind dared not move. The children noticed it first, a strange hum in the distance, a low, vibrating drone like the sound of 1,000 whispers gathering in secret. Dogs growled at nothing. Camels stamped the ground in panic. The sky itself seemed to pulse. Pharaoh sat brooding in his palace, his skin still irritated from the lice, his pride bruised from his magician's confession. He was tired of hearing Moses' name, tired of the people whispering about the God of the Hebrews, tired of his own fear trying to claw its way up his throat. But fear would soon take a different form. In the slave quarters of Goshen, Moses stood once more in the presence of the Lord. The message was clear. The next blow would not come with silence. This time, God would send a message into the very air of Egypt. Moses and Aaron stood again before Pharaoh. "This is what the Lord says," Moses declared, his voice thunderous and resolute. "Let my people go, so that they may serve me. For if you do not, I will send swarms of flies on you, on your officials, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with them, and the ground itself will be covered." Pharaoh scoffed. "Flies?" he sneered. "You threaten me with flies?" Moses didn't flinch. He leaned in. "But I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, and no swarm shall touch them. You will know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of this land, and I make a distinction between my people and yours." With that, Moses turned. The warning was over. The moment he left the palace, the air shuddered. It began like a distant roar, as if the very skies had begun to growl. At first, it looked like a mist rolling in from the edge of the desert. But this mist pulsed, twisted, swirled like a beast with 1,000 wings. Then the hum became a howl. The flies had come. Not houseflies, not harmless insects. These were divine agents of torment. Fanged, vicious, relentless. They came like a tidal wave of black storm. Swarms darkened the skies, eclipsing the sun. They poured into windows, crept beneath doors, and clung to every surface. They infested clothing, hair, mouths. They burrowed into food storage, drink jars, and bedrooms. People ran screaming, but there was no escape. The flies pursued like predators. Merchants in the market fled as their goods were devoured. Cattle bellowed in agony as flies invaded their eyes and nostrils. Infants cried, wrapped in blankets that offered no protection. The stench was unbearable. Rotting food, blood, and excrement stirred by buzzing wings. Egypt became a nightmare. The swarms entered temples, mocking the gods yet again. They coated golden idols, desecrating their beauty. Priests tore at their garments, crying out in frustration. Where was Ra, the god of the sun, to shine light into this darkness? Where was Geb, god of the earth, who was supposed to keep balance? Why were they silent? And yet, in the land of Goshen, not a single fly was seen. Their skies remained clear, their homes untouched. The children played, the animals rested. The distinction was undeniable. In his palace, Pharaoh was no longer calm. The flies crawled across his throne. They nested in his food. Even his personal guards swatted and cursed. He could no longer hide his torment behind robes and authority. He summoned Moses. His voice trembled, an edge of desperation bleeding through his usual arrogance. "Go, sacrifice to your God, but do it here, in Egypt." But Moses refused. "We must go a 3-day journey into the wilderness, as our God has commanded." Pharaoh's eyes darted, calculating. "Fine, go. Just don't go far. And pray for me." Moses agreed but warned him, "Do not lie again." He left, prayed, and the Lord honored the request. The swarms vanished like smoke, and for a brief moment, the sky above Egypt breathed again. But Pharaoh's heart hardened. Again, he broke his promise. The moment the pressure lifted, so did his word. He saw the clear skies and mistook mercy for weakness. He thought he had regained control. But God wasn't finished. Not even close. This was not about flies. This was not about Moses. This was God drawing a line between rebellion and righteousness, between those who heed his voice and those who mock it. Egypt had been warned, but it refused to listen. Now the Lord would raise the stakes, and Egypt would bleed for it. The fifth plague, the plague on livestock when gods collapse and kingdoms rot. It began at dawn. But this dawn didn't rise with promise, it groaned with dread. All across Egypt, the silence was heavier than ever before. The flies were gone, but the memory of their relentless buzzing still echoed in the minds of the people. Every man, woman, and child breathed carefully, as if afraid their very exhale would summon another judgment. Pharaoh thought he had endured enough, but the fourth plague was just the beginning. Now the land itself was about to betray its masters. In Goshen, Moses stood in the stillness of early morning. His staff gleamed in the light as he looked across the horizon. Behind him stood Aaron. Before them, a message from God sharper than any sword. "Go again to Pharaoh," the Lord had said, "and tell him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so they may serve me. For if you refuse, my hand will bring a severe plague on your livestock in the fields, on your horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats.' But there was one more piece. 'But I will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt.' And so Moses obeyed. Pharaoh was growing restless. He didn't want to see Moses, but he couldn't avoid him. He knew the moment the man of God entered the court, something was about to die. And this time Moses didn't come to warn, he came to declare. "By this time tomorrow," Moses said, his eyes locked with Pharaoh's, "the hand of the Lord will strike down your livestock. The fields will become graves, and your herds, your strength, your wealth, your pride, will fall dead before your eyes." Pharaoh said nothing, but his silence was not repentance. It was arrogance pretending to be wisdom. The next morning came, and with it death. It didn't start with noise. There were no roars, no shouts, no storms. It began with a soft groan in the barns. Then a collapse in the fields. One by one, Egypt's livestock fell. Every horse in the stables of warriors trembled, then dropped like stone. The donkeys stopped braying and began twitching on the ground. Camels foamed at the mouth before collapsing on desert trails. Cattle let out mournful moans, their eyes rolling back, legs flailing, then still. The goats bleated in panic, then in silence. Sheep herders ran screaming as entire flocks died in waves, with no wound, no visible cause. Just sudden, divine ruin. The smell of death soaked the air. The fields of Egypt transformed into vast cemeteries. And yet, in Goshen, the livestock grazed peacefully. Every goat, every cow, every horse remained untouched. Not one animal was harmed. The Egyptian scouts were sent to confirm. They returned, stunned. "Not a single beast in Israel's camp has died," they reported. The distinction was undeniable. Again, still, Pharaoh's heart refused to break. He stood among the corpses of his kingdom's livestock, his nostrils filled with the stench of decay, and he still clenched his fists. Why? Because Egypt didn't just lose animals, it lost its gods. Apis, the bull god of strength, was powerless. Hathor, the goddess with the face of a cow, was shamed. Cum, the ram-headed creator, was humiliated. Every animal that had once been worshipped in marble temples now lay rotting in fields. The gods of Egypt were crumbling, not in the heavens, but on the earth. And Pharaoh knew it. But pride is a prison, and Pharaoh had swallowed the key. In the towns, panic spread. Farmers wept beside the broken bodies of their animals. The economy buckled. Markets crashed. Trade routes halted. The Egyptian cavalry, the pride of its military, stood without mounts. Still, Pharaoh refused. Still, he hardened. Because in his soul, he wasn't just wrestling with Moses. He was at war with God himself. But Yahweh would not relent. This was not the end. This was unraveling. Egypt had insulted the God of the Hebrews, enslaved his people, mocked his warnings. Now, the judgment wasn't just touching their air or their animals, it was moving closer to their skin, to their health, to their very flesh. This was no longer a contest of power. This was a disassembling of a nation, and Yahweh was just getting started. The sixth plague, the plague of boils when flesh betrays the proud. It started not with thunder, not with darkness, not even with blood. It started with ashes, black, weightless, and almost silent, ashes of judgment. Moses stood at the edge of Pharaoh's city with Aaron beside him, their eyes fixed on the palace that still gleamed with gold and rebellion. God's command was precise. There was no need for long speeches now. The warnings had been spoken. The mercy had been extended. The line had been crossed. Take handfuls of soot from a furnace, God had said, and let Moses toss it into the air in front of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over all Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land. No staff raised this time. No declaration of war. Just ashes, lifted high into the morning wind. The moment Moses threw the soot, the wind obeyed. It scattered the black dust high into the air, and the unseen cloud traveled fast, carried like divine poison on invisible wings, touched no building, stained no fabric. It searched for flesh. Then it began. A royal guard, standing watch on the palace steps, winced, then screamed. A priest, chanting in a temple, collapsed, clawing at his face. A child, playing in the dust, dropped to the ground, his laughter turning into shrieks. All across Egypt, skin erupted into torment. Boils, angry, burning, infected wounds that swelled like cursed fruit. The flesh of men blistered and festered. The rich and the poor alike were struck. No ointment could ease the pain. No priest could explain it. No God could stop it. And what made it worse was the silence of the heavens, the silence of Ra, Isis, Sekhmet, the silence of the gods they trusted. Not even the magicians of Pharaoh could stand. The very ones who had mocked Moses with counterfeit miracles now trembled in agony, unable to even rise to their feet. Their skin oozed. Their mouths moaned. Their pride was peeled off, layer by layer, by invisible fingers of divine fury. Pharaoh stood in his palace, untouched for a moment, but not for long. A servant collapsed at his feet. A royal steward began vomiting, clutching his stomach as sores ruptured across his chest. Even Pharaoh's own physicians, men paid in silver to protect the king, fell one by one. And as Pharaoh looked around, something in his stomach shifted. This was no natural disease. This was not a foreign curse. This was not the work of Moses. This was Yahweh advancing. Out in the fields, the livestock of Egypt, those that hadn't died in the fifth plague, writhed in agony. Even animals were not spared. The ground was littered with groaning bodies. Traders, merchants, warriors, midwives, all bore the same torment. But in Goshen, not one Israelite was afflicted. Their skin was whole, their steps steady. Their camp remained a sanctuary in the storm. Again, and again, and again, God made a distinction. For the first time, there was no request to let the people go. This plague didn't come with a warning. No room for negotiation. No words of mercy. God didn't ask this time, he acted. Because Pharaoh had not just rejected God, he had resisted truth. Now, even his body was beginning to bear the rebellion of his soul. Pharaoh still refused. Still, he could barely stand. His own skin might have been blistering by now, but his heart, it was sealed, hardened like stone under divine pressure. His counselors begged him to yield. His priests wept for help. His magicians, those arrogant sorcerers of the early days, were now mute, their voices lost beneath groans of pain. And yet Pharaoh stood, like a tower of pride in a kingdom that was crumbling brick by brick. But God was not finished. This was only the sixth blow. He had 4 more hammers to fall. And now he would lift his hand higher. The pain didn't wake Pharaoh. Then terror would. Because the next plague would not just fall on skin, it would fall from the sky. The 7th plague. The plague of hail, when heaven becomes a weapon. The day began with a strange quiet. Egypt, though bruised and bleeding from the previous plagues, was trying to return to normal. Merchants reopened their market stalls. Slaves were whipped back into motion. Pharaoh's guards, now limping and bandaged, patrolled the streets again. The city's priests burned incense, praying for peace, while rumors of Yahweh's next strike whispered through the alleys like desert wind. But there was no normal anymore. Not since Moses came down from the wilderness carrying the fire of a living God. And now the sky itself was about to split in judgment. Moses walked through the palace gates once more. No army, no sword, just the authority of the God who had turned rivers to blood, raised frogs from the Nile, stirred lice from dust, summoned flies from nowhere, and blistered the skin of every living soul in Egypt. Moses' face was like flint. His eyes burned with divine confidence. This was not a prophet pleading anymore. This was a general of heaven delivering a final warning. He stood before Pharaoh, still stubborn, still breathing arrogance like a thick perfume, and declared, "By now, I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." Then the words dropped like hammers from Moses' mouth. "Tomorrow at this time, I will send the worst hailstorm Egypt has ever seen, from the day it was founded until now." This is more than a story. It's a spiritual wake-up call. If something in this episode is hitting deep, or even shocking you, tell us what you think about this video in the comments. Your thoughts matter. Moses turned and left. No debate, no compromise. The court was silent. But even Pharaoh's officials, those who had once mocked Moses, felt a chill deeper than fear. They hurried to their homes, yelling to their families, warning their servants. "Bring in the animals. Get under shelter. Yahweh is going to strike again." For the first time, some Egyptians believed. They had seen the boils. They had heard the screams. They remembered the flies, the blood, the endless torment. And now, even before a single drop of rain, many were already trembling. The next day came, not with a sunrise but with a sky of iron. Dark clouds twisted over Egypt like bruises on heaven's skin. Thunder rolled, not in distant grumbles, but in violent growls that shook the palace walls. And then, the sky cracked. A roar of lightning sliced through the clouds and slammed into the earth like the wrath of angels. And from the heavens came hail, not ice the size of stones but boulders, crashing, smashing, flattening everything in its path. It was not just a storm, it was a divine warhead. Fields were destroyed in seconds. Grain was flattened, barley snapped, trees splintered like bones under a giant's fist. Livestock, left in the open by foolish masters, were crushed where they stood, legs broken, skulls caved in. Even strong men, those who dared to run across open streets, were not fast enough. The hail tore flesh from bone. It didn't just fall, it slammed the earth like divine artillery. And in the middle of the storm came fire. Yes, fire. Forks of flame danced across the hail, weaving in and out like serpents made of light. Hail rained down, and fire leapt upward. No Egyptian god had ever shown such fury. No temple could hide from it. No chariot could outrun it. No prayer could stop it. This was heaven unchained. Inside the palace, Pharaoh watched the chaos unfold through his windows. The sky ablaze, the ground shattered. He had seen plagues before, but never like this. This was no trick. This was not sorcery. This was the voice of a holy God speaking through storm and flame. For the first time, Pharaoh bent. His heart, scorched by pride, now cracked beneath fear. He summoned Moses and Aaron again, his royal robes torn and wet, his eyes hollow. "This time I have sinned," he said. Yahweh is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to Yahweh, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer. Moses listened, but he wasn't fooled. Pharaoh had made promises before. Words of surrender didn't impress heaven anymore. Still, Moses said, "When I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail, so you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still do not fear God." And true to his word, Moses walked out into the storm, stood in the broken streets of Egypt, and lifted his hands to heaven. The thunder silenced, the hail ceased, the fire vanished, and in the eerie calm that followed, the nation of Egypt lay in ruins. Fields flattened, livestock gone, trees stripped bare, houses shattered. But even in devastation, Pharaoh's heart hardened again. He looked upon his broken kingdom, weighed his pride against God's command, and chose rebellion once more. He was no longer just defying Moses. He was resisting the one who held lightning in his breath and judgment in his hands. And so Yahweh prepared his next weapon. Because if fire and ice couldn't break Pharaoh's pride, then devouring swarms would rise from the horizon next. The eighth plague, the plague of locusts when hunger had wings. The winds shifted, not with thunder this time, not with hail or fire or the roar of angry clouds. This time it came as a whisper, a warm wind from the east, silent, invisible, but carrying death on its back. Egypt was broken. The fields lay in ruins from the hail. Trees, once heavy with fruit, stood as splintered skeletons across the landscape. Men stumbled through debris, mouths dry, eyes wild. Pharaoh's guards, once proud and dressed in gold, now marched in tattered linen, their bronze helmets dulled by shame and soot. But they did not know true famine yet. They thought the worst had passed. They were wrong. Moses came once more, the man who walked unbothered through fire, thunder, and storm. He and Aaron stood at the palace gates like watchmen over Pharaoh's crumbling empire. There was no need for dramatic gestures, no plagues in hand, no signs in the sky, only a warning, a simple one, soft, but sharper than any sword. "Let my people go, or tomorrow I will bring locusts into your land. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left, whatever escaped the hail, every leaf, every blade, every hope." And then Moses turned, leaving Pharaoh to the silence behind him. But not everyone in that court shared Pharaoh's defiance anymore. Pharaoh's counselors, once laughing, once skeptical, now trembled. These were men who had seen nations rise and fall, who had advised during famines and wars, but nothing like this. They rushed to Pharaoh, their voices low but urgent, as if even the wind might hear. "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" There it was, the word Pharaoh never wanted to hear. Ruined, the greatest empire on earth, brought low by a nomadic shepherd with a staff and the name of a god Pharaoh refused to acknowledge. Under pressure, Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron back. But true to his cunning, he tried to bargain again. "Go, worship the Lord your God," he said. "But tell me, who exactly will be going?" Moses didn't flinch. "We will go with our young and old, our sons and daughters, our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh's jaw tightened. The offer had been rejected. Again. The pride in him still burned hotter than the hail had ever fallen. "No, only the men may go," he spat. "That's what you're really after, isn't it? Worship? Go. But the women and children stay." And just like that, Pharaoh sealed his fate again. Moses and Aaron were driven from his presence. The skies were still blue then, the winds still soft. But Yahweh had already spoken to Moses. "Stretch out your hand over Egypt so that locusts swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail." And then the wind changed. It began in the east, a dry wind, hotter than usual. It blew for a full day, then another, then a third. Egyptians watched the horizon, puzzled. Farmers felt it in their bones but said nothing. Women gathered their children indoors. Merchants closed their stalls early. On the morning of the fourth day, they appeared. First just a few, then clouds of them. Locusts, not the kind found after rain. Not the small grasshoppers that flick past a traveler's feet. Their wings thundered like war drums. Their legs crunched over rooftops. Their eyes reflected the sunlight like polished obsidian. They came in waves, riding the eastern wind like soldiers on chariots. Billions of them. Within hours, they covered the land. The sky disappeared beneath them. The sun dimmed. It was like night at midday. They ate everything. The few plants that had survived the hail devoured. Fresh stalks, vines, and remaining herbs chewed down to dust. They even gnawed on wooden doors, linen tents, and the bark of stripped trees. Farmers wept. Children screamed. Priests offered sacrifices, but no god of Egypt answered. Even Pharaoh's personal gardens, once fragrant with flowers and lined with exotic plants, were shredded in minutes. No corner of the land was spared. No roof untouched. It wasn't just a plague. It was starvation wearing wings. Inside the palace, Pharaoh collapsed on his throne, his breath short. He had tried to bargain. He had tried to outlast this god. But now even the insects bowed to Moses. He summoned the prophet again. His voice was no longer proud, but pleading. I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me. Moses said nothing. He turned and left. And once outside the city, he stretched his arms toward heaven again. A great west wind rose. It swept across the land like a divine broom, pushing every locust into the Red Sea, drowning the invaders in waves of judgment. And suddenly, the sky was blue again, but the ground was bare. The trees were skeletal. The fields were naked. The barns were empty. And Pharaoh's heart was still hard. He had lost his harvest. He had lost his pride. He had lost the people's trust. But he would not lose his grip on the Israelites. Not yet, because Pharaoh would rather starve beside his throne than bow his neck before heaven. And so Yahweh readied the next blow. Not from the wind, not from the sky, but this time from the heavens themselves. The ninth plague, the plague of darkness, when Egypt lost the face of God. It began at dawn, the moment when the skies should have stretched golden over the Nile, when the first shimmer of Ra, Egypt's sun god, would kiss the tips of the palace walls. There was nothing, no sunrise, no horizon, only a slow, unnatural dimming, as though the heavens had turned their face away. Birds never sang, the roosters never crowed, and the priests of Ra stood outside their temples, arms lifted high, waiting. But the sun did not answer. Egypt had lost the voice of light. Moses did not return to Pharaoh's palace this time. There was no warning, only the silence of judgment. It was Yahweh who spoke to Moses in private. Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. And when Moses raised his hand toward the heavens, the sun vanished. Not like an eclipse, where a shadow passes and light fights to break through. This was thick, consuming, total. It was not the absence of light. It was the presence of something else. A tangible, oppressive weight. A blanket of blindness that choked the soul. In a single breath, Egypt was swallowed whole. Day turned to midnight. Shadows grew teeth. Even the oil lamps, torches, and fires, the very tools of man's brilliance, could not pierce the veil. They flickered, sputtered, and died like frightened children. The land groaned under it. And the people, they screamed. For 3 days, the darkness reigned. Children clung to their mothers' legs, weeping. Husbands cried out to gods who had no voice. Wives sat in corners, trembling at sounds they couldn't see. Lamps were lit by shaking hands, but the flames cast no light. Men wandered into walls. People tripped, stumbled, fell, some too afraid to rise again. No one left their homes. No one dared, because something in the dark watched them. This darkness wasn't natural. It wasn't a sandstorm or solar phenomenon. It had intention, and everyone could feel it. It followed. It whispered. It breathed. It was the absence of all hope, all reason. Prison with no walls. Even the animals felt it. Cows lowed in panic, cats hissed at shadows, and dogs refused to leave their corners. No star shone. No moon glimmered. Egypt was erased from the map of the heavens. But in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was light. Fires burned. Children played. Songs were sung around evening meals. The stars danced in the sky over Goshen like they always had. The contrast was a spear through Pharaoh's heart. His gods, Ra, Horus, Thoth, had fallen silent. But Yahweh's people were untouched. The god of slaves had command over light itself. Inside the royal chambers, Pharaoh sat on his throne, but his crown meant nothing in the dark. His robes, his gold, his power, they could not conjure a single star. He was blind not just in vision but in spirit. He had seen water become blood. He had heard the croaks of frogs in his palace. He had watched lice and flies swarm his people. He had seen livestock fall and boils burst like curses on skin. He had heard the locusts eat the bones of his fields. But never had he felt fear like this, because this plague was personal. It did not destroy the land, it destroyed the mind. And finally, on the third day, when even the brave had gone silent, Pharaoh called for Moses again. Servants had to lead Moses by hand through the blackened halls, their steps slow, their breaths shallow. No one spoke until Moses stood before the throne. The air was heavy, like breathing through ash. Pharaoh's voice cracked in the dark. Go worship the Lord. Take your women, your children. Just leave. Moses stood still. But Pharaoh added, like venom at the end of a prayer, but your flocks and herds must stay behind. Moses' eyes narrowed in the darkness. He answered with fire in his voice. You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. Pharaoh exploded. The tension snapped like a whip in the blackness. Leave me. Make sure you never appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. And Moses, lit only by the presence of Yahweh, replied coldly, just as you say, I will never appear before you again. Moses turned and walked into the dark. But what Pharaoh didn't know was that Moses had just delivered the final warning. Egypt's heart had been broken. The sky was gone. Its crops were lost. His priests were silent, and yet Pharaoh still clung to control like a dying man clutches dust. But he had touched the line. He had refused to let even the animals go, those which were to be sacrificed to God. And so now Yahweh would touch what Pharaoh feared most. Not his crops, not his land, not his sight, but his blood. The 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn, when judgment knocked on every door. The air over Egypt was still, not the calm of peace, but the unsettling hush before a storm that the world has never seen again. It wasn't just quiet, it was anticipation. A divine stillness had settled over the land, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something final, something irreversible. And on the throne of Egypt sat a man who had defied heaven one plague too many. Pharaoh had drawn the line in the sand. He had refused the God of Moses, rejected mercy, and dared the wrath of the Almighty. Now the God of Israel would answer with the full weight of justice. That night began like any other in Egypt. The Nile flowed lazily beneath the moon. The stars flickered above, oblivious to the dread that had crept like a shadow across the cities and villages. But in the land of Goshen, among the Israelites, something strange was happening. Families were moving with urgency. They weren't packing belongings for travel or celebrating. They were obeying a command, one unlike any before. Yahweh had given Moses the instruction, speak to the people. Tell every household to take a lamb, one without blemish. Kill it at twilight. Take the blood and smear it on the sides and tops of the doorframes. Roast the lamb. Eat it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. and do it with your cloak tucked in, your sandals on, your staff in hand. For this is the Lord's Passover. Passover. The word had never existed before that night. But after this night, it would never be forgotten. Because the blood on those doorposts wasn't decoration. It wasn't ritual. It was a shield, a divine signal, a silent cry that said, "Here, Lord, see the blood. Pass over us." Inside those homes, fathers prayed in whispers. Mothers held their children close. Some wept, some trembled. All waited, because Moses had spoken it clearly. About midnight, the Lord will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in the land will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, even the firstborn of the cattle. There will be a loud cry throughout Egypt, worse than has ever been or ever will be again. In Pharaoh's palace, gold gleamed under torchlight. But even luxury could not silence the growing sense of dread. The royal priests were speechless. The magicians who had once mimicked Yahweh's signs had long since been reduced to fear-stricken men. Even Pharaoh's eldest son, the crowned prince, his future, his pride, his legacy, felt a chill that no fire could drive away. He looked into his father's eyes, and he saw uncertainty. For the first time, Pharaoh could offer no promise of safety, not even to his son. This is more than a story. It's a spiritual wake-up call. If you're learning something new, or just feeling stirred deep down, stop scrolling and subscribe now. We're just getting started. Then the hour came. Midnight. Time slowed. Some claimed they heard it. A low wind, like the rustling of wings sweeping across the nation. Others heard nothing. But everywhere the effect was the same. A silence, then a scream. The first wail echoed from the southern fields, where a wealthy Egyptian farmer found his son lifeless in his bed. Then another cry, from a noblewoman whose infant had stopped breathing in her arms. Then another, and another, in every village, in every city, in every Egyptian home, from servants to soldiers, from merchants to magistrates. Death had passed through. It did not knock. It did not ask. It simply claimed what was never offered. Even Pharaoh's own son, the boy who once ran laughing through palace halls, the child whose name was carved into the walls of temples, lay dead in the arms of his grieving father. The scream that came from Pharaoh's throat was not one of rage. It was one of agony. A king defeated not by sword or army, but by a God he refused to obey. He tore his robes. He fell to the ground. His throne, his pride, his gods, his empire, could not save his son. And across the land Egypt cried. Not just one voice, not just 10, but thousands. It was as if the very soul of the nation had been ripped in half. Every home knew grief. Every heart knew judgment. Every eye knew tears. Except in Goshen, where not a single cry was heard. Where no blood was spilled, because blood had already been offered. The Lamb had taken the place of the firstborn, and judgment passed over. That very night, Pharaoh sent word, no longer in anger, no longer with pride, but with desperation. Rise, go. Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Take your flocks, your herds. Take everything, and go. But bless me also. The man who once declared, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" now begged for a blessing. The mighty king of Egypt was broken. And as the Israelites gathered their families, packed their unleavened bread, and marched out of Egypt with the silver and gold given to them by the Egyptians in haste, they did not leave as slaves. They left as a nation, forged in suffering, delivered by power, and marked by the blood of the Lamb. A night of terror for Egypt became the night of freedom for God's people. And all of heaven watched as the first great exodus began. But the story is not over, because Pharaoh, though shattered, still had rage smoldering in his bones. And soon he would rise again, not to plead, but to pursue. Moral lessons from Moses versus Pharaoh. The real power behind the 10 plagues. 1. God is supreme over all powers. The plagues were not random disasters. They were calculated judgments against Egypt's false gods. Every plague shouted one truth. There is no God besides Yahweh. No idol, ruler, system, or kingdom can stand when God moves. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Isaiah 45 verse 5. 2. Pride leads to destruction. Pharaoh's hardened heart is a sobering reminder. When pride rules the throne of your life, you invite disaster. Even after miracle upon miracle, Pharaoh refused to humble himself until it cost him everything. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4 verse 6. 3. Obedience can move heaven. Moses didn't lead with confidence. He led with obedience. He obeyed God's voice, despite fear, stuttering speech, and Pharaoh's threats. Obedience opened the floodgates of heaven's power. To obey is better than sacrifice. 1 Samuel 15 verse 22. 4. God hears the cry of the oppressed. The Israelites were slaves for 400 years, but God never forgot them. The cries of the broken reached his throne. He moved heaven and earth to rescue his people, and he still does. I have heard their groaning, and am come down to deliver them. Exodus 3 verse 7. 5. Judgment delayed is not judgment denied. God gave Pharaoh chance after chance to repent. But when mercy is mocked, judgment comes. The story reminds us that God is loving but also just. Mercy has a window. Don't close it with rebellion. Behold, now is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 2. 6. God can use the weak to humble the mighty. Moses was once a fugitive with a speech problem, but God used him to break the back of an empire. Never underestimate what God can do with someone who says, "Here I am. Send me." His strength is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. 7. Deliverance comes with a process. God didn't snap his fingers and take Israel out in one night. The plagues came one after another, a process of deliverance, not instant rescue. Sometimes your breakthrough will be progressive, not immediate, but still divine. 8. God makes a distinction between his people and the world. Throughout the plagues, God protected Israel while judging Egypt. Light remained in Goshen while darkness ruled Egypt. This is a reminder that those who walk with God live under his covering. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. Psalm 91 verse 4. 9. Spiritual warfare is real. The battle was not just political, it was spiritual. Each plague was a strike against Egypt's demon-backed religion. The same is true today. Behind many struggles is a war in the unseen. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Ephesians 6 verse 12. 10. God always keeps his promises. What he told Abraham centuries before, he fulfilled through Moses. The Exodus proves that not a single promise of God fails. He's faithful to his word, even if it takes time. He who promised is faithful. Hebrews 10 verse 23. A brief prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for showing us your power, your mercy, and your justice through the story of Moses and Pharaoh. Help us to walk humbly before you, never hardening our hearts when you speak. Teach us to trust you even in seasons of waiting, and obey you even when we feel weak. Cover us as you did your people in Goshen. Deliver us from every bondage, physical, emotional, or spiritual. And use us, like Moses, to bring freedom to others. In Jesus' name, amen. Having gone through the breathtaking journey of the 10 plagues, and witnessed how God showcased his unstoppable power against Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt, this isn't just history. It's a wake-up call. The same God who split the Nile, darkened the skies, and passed through Egypt with judgment, is still alive, still mighty, and still speaking today. So here's the challenge. Have a rethink. Where do you stand with this God? Are you resisting him like Pharaoh, or walking with him like Moses? We invite you to embrace his family, not religion, but relationship. And if this video stirred your spirit, helped you see God in a new light, or reminded you of his faithfulness, you can support this growing family by subscribing to our channel and sharing this video with someone who might need a word of strength, warning, or hope. Don't just watch, be part of the movement. God is still writing stories through people like you.